Welcome to another episode of Scottish Murders. I'm your host, Dawn. This week's episode is solved and took place in 1868 in Dumfriesshire. But please be advised that this case does involve the rape and murder of a child. My sources for this episode came from the newspapers from back in 1868, from the British Newspaper Archive, and from the book Scottish Murders by Martin Bagley. The language used in the newspapers back then was a bit different to today, so for authenticity, I'm going to use, where appropriate, the language and words of 1868. It was about 3 p.m. on a cold and showery day on Saturday the 1st of February 1868, and Jane Crichton was on her knees in the kitchen scrubbing the floor, one of the many chores she carried out on a Saturday. Jane was so engrossed in this task, running slightly behind due to unexpected visitors having dropped by earlier in the day, that she didn't hear the kitchen door open. The first Jane was aware someone was in her home was when she heard the crack of a gun being fired, followed by a searing pain in her head. Jane's attacker was shocked to realise, though, that Jane was still conscious and was beginning to slowly get to her feet, clutching her head. And so her attacker grabbed the nearby fire tongs and firstly hit Jane on the head before removing his pocket knife and proceeding to stab Jane in the neck 3 times and slicing her throat very near the jugular, before Jane, putting up a tremendous fight, managed to get the knife from her attacker, at which point Jane's attacker dragged her out of the kitchen through to a more secluded back room and continued to subject Jane to an onslaught of violence, culminating in her attacker throwing Jane onto a chair and beginning to press her neck against the back rail. Jane battled on, but began to feel herself slipping into unconsciousness, and suddenly there was a knock at the kitchen door, which caused Jane's attacker to leave the seriously wounded Jane and run from the house. As Jane lay there, seriously wounded and in utter disbelief at what had just happened, while thankful for the 2 boys who had come knocking on her kitchen door to deliver a message from a nearby farm, Jane could only think, please let Thomasina be okay. One of the towns in Dumfriesshire was Annan, which is where the second issue when I was researching this case arose, the first being that Dumfriesshire no longer exists and is now known as Dumfries and Galloway. The second issue was regarding the location of both Annan and Cummertrees, the 2 places talked about in today's story. Nowadays, according to Google Maps, Cummertrees is located 3.9 miles or 6.2 kilometres slightly south and west of the town of Annan. However, back in 1868, according to the newspapers, Cummertrees was located about 3 to 3.5 miles or 4.8 to 5.6 kilometres north of Annan. This discrepancy could be due to Annan having grown and developed over the years and its centre point having changed, but if anyone knows the actual reason for this, then please let me know. Dumfriesshire is located in southern Scotland. As today's story is from 1868, I'm going to go with Cummertrees being 3.5 miles or 5.6 kilometres north of Annan, and this is where the Scott family lived. There was John Scott, who was a shoemaker and grocer, his wife and their 11 children, and they lived in a cottage located at the south of the village of Cummertrees, about 21 miles or 33 kilometres northwest of Carlisle. Each Saturday morning, Mrs. Scott would send her 9-year-old daughter, Thomasina, the 3.5 miles to Annan on foot to purchase some groceries to sell in their grocery shop and to keep their large household going over the week ahead. Sending a 9-year-old child such a distance on foot to collect groceries each week would be unheard of today, but back then, or even back in the 1930s when my gran was a child, she and her brothers and sisters used to walk this distance regularly alone, nobody thought twice about it. And in my gran and Thomasina's case, children would actually quite enjoy the freedom it afforded them. And so, as usual, at 11 a.m. on Saturday the 1st of February 1868, Thomasina's mum gave Thomasina 10 shillings for the purchases in Annan, told her that if it was raining when she was due to come back, then she could catch the train, but otherwise she was to walk back as usual, before waving off the skipping and happy Thomasina. But the rain wouldn't even hold out long enough for Thomasina to reach Annan, as about a mile into her journey the heavens opened and the rain began to pour down. Thankfully, Thomasina was near Longford's cottage, where Robert Crichton, who was an agricultural servant, his wife Jane Crichton, and their son John lived. Thomasina knew Robert and Jane and knew that they would welcome her in until the rain stopped. And so Thomasina ran the short distance to Longford's cottage and knocked on the door, where Jane invited her in to get dry and have a drink and a bite to eat. But her husband Robert was out working the land at the time. Thomasina was pleased to be out of the rain, but as Jane led Thomasina into the kitchen, Thomasina noticed that Jane already had company, but she knew the boy who was in the kitchen, and so Thomasina politely smiled and said hello before sitting at the kitchen table along with Mrs. Crichton and her other visitor, 19-year-old Robert Smith. Robert Smith, according to the Scottish Murders book, had been orphaned when his mum and dad had died when he was 8 years old, and since then he had had to look after himself, so he was quite self-sufficient. Robert had been well known in and around the area, and locals had taken kindly to him by offering him labouring jobs at various farms in the area, including with Robert Crichton, when there had been harvest work to be done. And so when Robert Smith was in the area, he would visit the Crichtons and say hello, possibly to see if there was any work for him. Thomasina waited a short while at Longford's cottage for the rain to go off, all the while chatting with Jane Crichton and Robert Smith, telling them she was heading into Annan to buy groceries for her parents. And so as soon as Thomasina was able to resume her journey, about 12 noon, she got up from the table and said bye to Robert and Jane. Although it was at this time that Robert Smith announced that he was heading the same way and would walk along with her. Neither Jane or Thomasina thought anything of this. It was Robert Smith. They'd both known him for a while and he seemed pleasant. So Jane said bye to the pair and returned to her chores, not realising just who Thomasina was walking away with. But after Robert Smith returned to Longford's cottage about 3 p.m, while Jane was on her knees cleaning the kitchen floor and firstly shot at her before hitting her with a poker, stabbing her neck and throat and trying to strangle her over the back of a kitchen chair, Jane then began to realise just what danger 9-year-old Thomasina could be in. But she prayed the little girl would be safe and sound. Back at Comertrees, as the 4:10 train arrived at the village and Thomasina did not alight, her parents became concerned. Thomasina was always so quick in returning from Annan each Saturday. She never dawdled and always came back with exactly what was needed. What could have delayed her today, thought her parents. Thomasina's parents initially sent another of their children a short distance along the road from Annan that Thomasina would have taken to see if she decided to walk home instead, but there was no sign. Mr. and Mrs. Scott then asked a family friend if they would travel to Annan to inquire at the shops where Thomasina would have gone to see when she had left. However, the family member soon returned to Mr. and Mrs. Smith's cottage, but not with the news they had hoped for. Thomasina had not been seen in Annan all day, although the family member had other, more alarming news to share with the couple. Someone had tried to kill Jane Crichton. Shocked by this news, but not for 1 second thinking it could have anything to do with Thomasina's disappearance, but not wanting to rule anything out, Mr. and Mrs. Scott made their way to Longford's cottage. Upon the two boys arriving at Longford's cottage to deliver their message to Jane Crichton, knocking at the door and 19-year-old Robert Smith throwing the door open and rushing past them with blood on his hands and clothes, they soon discovered a severely injured Jane Crichton, who was in urgent need of medical attention. And so one of the boys ran back to the nearby farm to raise the alarm, while the other one tried to make Jane comfortable. Soon the local doctor and police officer arrived and were shocked by the scene that they saw. While the police officer questioned the boys about what had happened, the local doctor began to work on Jane's injuries, which required the removal of 3 pellets from her head. Jane, remarkably though, soon recovered and was able to tell the officer what had happened and who had done this to her, confirming what the 2 young boys had already told the police officer, that her attacker had been 19-year-old Robert Smith, and the hunt to capture Robert was on. But it wouldn't be long before another search was being carried out, as when Mr. and Mrs. Scott arrived at Longford's cottage to speak to Jane, their worst fears were realised when Jane confirmed that Thomasina had visited her earlier in the day while the weather was bad, but had left about 12 noon in the company of none other than Robert Smith, Jane's attempted murderer. Mr. and Mrs. Scott were distraught at their discovery, as was Jane to discover that Thomasina hadn't made it back home. The Scotts travelled back home as quickly as they could, but it was already dark outside before Mr. Scott and his neighbours began to search for signs of Thomasina by lantern light. but 3 hours later at 11 p.m, Thomasina's body was found in a nearby plantation near the roadside, about half a mile from Longford's cottage. Thomasina had been violated in a most horrible manner and strangled with a leather bootlace that had been made into a noose. The 10 shillings Thomasina had been given by her mother had also been stolen. Now that Thomasina's disappearance had been solved with the sad discovery of her body, Robert Smith was not only being sought for Jane Crichton's attempted murder, but also for 9-year-old Thomasina Scott's murder. And thankfully, it not only wouldn't prove too hard to find him, but there wouldn't be a long, drawn-out trial, as he was arrested the following morning at his lodgings and charged with a rape, robbery, murder and attempted murder, to which he immediately pleaded guilty to. Also found in his lodgings was his blood-stained clothing, a noosed bootlace, some percussion caps, a boot that matched perfectly to the print left in the mud beside Thomasina's body, and money, which was thought to be the remainder of the 10 shillings he had stolen from Thomasina after he had gone into Annan after killing Thomasina and bought a pistol from an ironmonger's with which to kill Jane Crichton. When Robert Smith appeared in court to be formally charged with his crimes, which he immediately pleaded guilty to, he confessed that rape was the motive for his outrage upon Thomasina, and that the attempted murder of Jane Crichton was because he became alarmed that Jane could give testimony of his having left the cottage in the company of Thomasina, and so he felt he had no choice but to try and destroy this evidence. Robert was held awaiting his 2-day trial, scheduled for the 21st of April at Dumfries jail, at which time he decided to write a letter to Jane Crichton. It's quite a long letter, so I'm not going to read it all out, and you can find the full letter in the Scottish Murders book, but a few pertinent points were as follows. I write to let you know that I am well at present, hoping this will find you and all your family enjoying the good health. If the Lord had not been merciful to you and saved your life, if it had been the other way around, it would have been a most horrible case for me to have done. But I thank God that he was merciful to do so to you. You and your friends may be mad at me for it, but you can tell them all that it is against me that I would let any of them do anything to me now after I have seen it, for the Lord's hand is mightier than the devil's. I heard you were getting better. I hope that when you receive this, you will be all better and going about again the same as usual. Jane, I had many thoughts of taking away your life. I wanted to rob your house, and I did not know how to do it until that day the young girl came in. I thought if I had a pistol, I could soon have taken your life away. I thought it was all right, for I thought that the shot would have ended your days too, and then there would not have been any could have informed the police about me, and I would have got clear from the hands of the men in the meantime. The young girl is resting in the grave, and I will be there too soon, and I well deserve it, and something far worse. Give my kind love to all the neighbours, to your son John, and all the men, and tell them that I will not see none of them on earth, but I trust in God that I will see you and yours and them in heaven. Write soon, dear Jane, and let me know how you are now. It wasn't reported that Jane ever did write to Robert, but during a break in his trial, he would instead get to speak to Thomasina's mum. Robert Smith's 2-day trial took place at the Dumfries Circuit Court on Tuesday the 21st of April 1868, and according to the Greenock Advertiser, he appeared quite calm when he pleaded guilty to the charges of rape, attempted murder and robbery. However, when it came to the murder charge, he pleaded guilty instead to culpable homicide. If Robert was convicted of murder, then the only outcome of the trial would be a public hanging, so Robert's panel, or counsel, was trying to secure a different outcome for his client. This plea, however, was not accepted by the judge, Lord Justice Clark, and the trial began, with the prosecution calling 40 witnesses over the 2 days. Towards the end of the trial, realising that things were not looking good for his client, Robert's panel, Mr. Stark, told the court that at the time of the murder, his client was in the state of mind called, according to newspapers, either moral mania or monomania. According to Wikipedia, in the 19th century, monomania meant madness or frenzy and was a form of partial insanity conceived as a single psychological obsession in an otherwise sound mind. But moral insanity, or mania, and monomania were similar in that they were both abnormalities of an otherwise normal mind, though moral insanity or mania was a systemic malfunction and monomania was an isolated aberration. Both terms are used intermittently in different newspapers, but whichever one was used, or if both were, Mr. Stark urged the jury to take this into consideration, as well as the fact Robert Smith was so young, and he urged that if they did find him guilty, to please recommend mercy on him. On the second day, after all the witnesses had taken to the stand, and before the judge summed up, a short recess was given, and it was at this point that Thomasina's mum asked to see Robert Smith. According to the Greenock Advertiser on the 23rd of April, the meeting was a touching one. Mrs. Scott cried uncontrollably while Robert Smith wept, before Mrs. Scott told Robert Smith that she never expected to find him in his present condition, but apparently she told him that she forgave him for his crime. The pair then shook hands, and Thomasina's mum left the room to await the verdict, which, after Lord Justice Clerk summing up, the jury retired for a mere 7 minutes before returning with a unanimous verdict of guilty. Lord Justice Clerk then donned the customary black cap and solemnly sentenced 19-year-old Robert Smith to death by public hanging, the date and place being set for Tuesday the 12th of May 1868 in front of the county jail in Dumfries. Now usually after someone was sentenced to death, there would be efforts made to seek a reprieve, but the crimes of Robert Smith were so disturbing that no reprieve was sought. What was sought, though, was permission to have the hanging take place within the prison privately rather than in public. Of late there had been an outcry about public hangings in general really, many feeling them unsavoury and feeling they should be abolished, or at the very least carried out in private, not in front of a large crowd of people. And while it wouldn't be long before the laws around this did change, no permission was given for Robert Smith's hanging to take place in private. In the weeks between Robert being sentenced and his execution day, it was reported that he appeared quite resigned to his fate, accepted the enormity of his guilt, and was prepared to atone for his shocking crimes. He was reported to be quiet, subdued, and quite relaxed. He was reported to sleep quite well, take regular meals, actually gaining some weight, and appeared to have mental ease. He spoke regularly to the prison chaplain, but on being asked on his last night if he would like company in his cell, he was reported to say that he did not, as, "I think it would distract from my thoughts." And then it was the day of his execution, a wet, dreary day, to which Robert Smith awoke, dressed, and at 8 a.m. was led to the scaffold, where the crowds, although the usual large up to 3,000 and raucous crowds were instead small, between 400 and 600, and they were decorous in conduct, and the executioner awaited him. Robert's arms were secured and the cap placed on his head, at which point some of the crowd, which was predominantly made up of women and children, screamed and ran away. But Robert's face remained calm and resigned. Robert then stood on the drop. The executioner placed the rope around his neck, shook Robert's hand, drew the bolt back, and Robert fell. By 8:15 a.m., it was all over. Robert Smith was the last man to be hanged publicly in Scotland in 1868, which was in Dumfries. But Mary Timney, 6 years prior, in 1862, was the last woman to be publicly hanged in Scotland, also in the same spot as Robert Smith in Dumfries. But while Robert Smith pleaded guilty straight away to his crimes, was quiet and subdued in court, and accepting of his sentence, in Mary Timney's case it was the exact opposite, and it was quite a tumultuous and emotional journey to her end. But I'll tell you about that story next time. Now it's time for Scotland Then. And oh, there were so many interesting and intriguing stories I found in the newspapers from back then, but I can't tell you them all. So the stories that caught my eye in the newspapers from 1868, when Robert Smith's murder trial was going on, came from the Greenock Advertiser on Thursday the 23rd of April 1868. The first thing I noticed was the differences between the newspapers I used as sources for the previous episode covering a murder from 1982 to the newspapers from 1868. In the 1982 newspapers, they were full of different sized text, Huge black headlines all vying for your attention, broken up stories over different sized columns, and plenty of pictures to draw the eye. The 1868 newspapers, which only had 4 pages, were all written in the same sized small text, with each article's heading not much bigger in size and in capital letters. Nothing really draws the eye, and it's all just straight columns of text from one side of the page to the other, and it's so dense, it's hard to tell when one story ends and another begins. It's all very matter-of-fact and professional, and the style, tone and content were so different. And even though the Greenock Advertiser was a Scottish newspaper, a lot of what was reported was what was happening elsewhere in the UK and around the world, including from Paraguay, China, India, Africa, England, Japan, Australia and America. And the newspaper was split up into sections, including British legislation, foreign news, Scotland, criminal law, England, latest intelligence, agriculture and poetry, as well as sections on who had gone bankrupt in Scotland recently, what the state of trade was like, the amount of postage stamps required to be affixed to any newspaper you wanted to send to other countries. For example, for all you listeners in Australia, if you had been living back in 1868 and wanted a copy of the Greenock Advertiser sent to you from Scotland via a private ship, it would cost 1d, which is 1 old penny. And if it was to be sent via Marseille, it would be 3d, which would be 3 old pennies. And for our American listeners, if you lived back then and wanted the newspaper sent to you, it would cost 2d, 2 old pennies. Found that quite interesting. What was also interesting each week in the Greenock Advertiser was it featured the birth, death and marriage rates for the week prior in the 8 principal towns of Scotland, which were Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, Aberdeen, Paisley, Greenock, Leith and Perth, as well as the corresponding numbers from the same week 2 years prior. I'm not going to go through them all, don't worry, but the big ones with the biggest differences were Glasgow and Edinburgh. The births in Glasgow in this particular week in 1868 were 456, a rise of 61 from 2 years prior. The deaths were stated as being 285, a rise of 41 from 2 years prior. Marriage rates had dropped though, with there being 59 reported marriages in this week 2 years prior in 1866, but only 36 reported in 1868. While Glasgow was reporting an increase in deaths and births, but a decrease of marriages, Edinburgh was the exact opposite. They reported in 1866 there being 141 births in the particular week in April, but a reduction of 22 in the same week 2 years later. They reported a reduction of 32 deaths from 100 to 68, but there was an increase in marriage, being that of 22 in 1866 and 29 in 1868. The population of Glasgow was reported in 1861 as being 395,503, and in Edinburgh 170,444. There wasn't a massive fluctuation in the other 6 principal towns reported with their births, deaths or marriages. Okay, that's all of the stats out of the way. Now let's get into what else was happening in Scotland on the same week of Robert Smith's murder trial. Well, firstly, I found this tiny paragraph at the bottom of a page with no heading, just tacked onto the previous story, which read, "Her Majesty has been graciously pleased to present to the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh a copy of her recent work, Leaves from the Journal of Her Life in the Highlands." And that was it, which was very kind of Queen Victoria, but I was intrigued enough to do a bit more research to find out more about this. Leaves from the Journal of Her Life in the Highlands was a publication by Queen Victoria in 1864. After the success of this publication, more Leaves from the Journal of Her Life in the Highlands was published in 1884. In these journals, the Queen had included extracts from her diaries from when she visited the Scottish Highlands and Aberdeen with Prince Albert, where she expressed what the Highlands meant to her. The first journal was dedicated to her late husband, Prince Albert, who died in 1861, and the second journal was dedicated to John Brown after he died in 1883. John Brown was the Queen's favourite Scottish personal attendant and companion, who she greatly appreciated, and who Billy Connolly played in the film Mrs. Brown. However, according to Wikipedia, many others, including the Queen's children and other staff, resented John Brown for his influence and informal manner with the Queen. 42 photographs were also printed to accompany these journals, which were taken by a George Washington Wilson, who must have accompanied the Queen and the Prince on their many visits to the Highlands of Scotland. These journals were originally only meant for the Queen's family members and friends. However, it was suggested by a close friend of the Queen that a public version should be printed, as according to Cambridge.org, Queen Victoria had retreated from public life following Prince Albert's death, and the journal would give the public access to the Queen's life away from the politics of London. Queen Victoria readily agreed, but insisted that these public versions should not be so dear that everyone can buy it. One such diary extract I found on the Royal Collection Trust website read, "Independently of the beautiful scenery, there was a quiet, a retirement, a wildness, a liberty, and a solitude that had such a charm for us." The journals were extremely popular, and Queen Victoria became a best-selling author. It was a shame there was literally only a couple of lines about this in the newspaper, as I found it quite fascinating, and I imagine it would have been quite an interesting story for people to read back then. Okay, the next story that caught my eye was headed Death from Destitution. And this one is a bit of a mystery, so we'll have to come up with our own conclusions on this one. This story was about a 46-year-old man named William Smith, who by all accounts had had a bad few weeks of his life, although it appears this may have been a lot of its own doing. William had been turned adrift by friends he had previously been residing with, and before that his wife, on account of him doing nothing to maintain himself, although being quite fit to work. Since being turfed out by his friends, William had apparently just wandered about the town of Kilmarnock, homeless and apathetic, sleeping mostly on stairs or back courts. He never begged for food, but many took pity on him, and he was happy to accept, although he refused point blank to apply for relief to the parochial authorities. Well, one Saturday in particular, William's plight and condition attracted the attention of someone who finally talked him into going to the poor inspector for help. In return, the inspector sent William to a lodging house, where he was given refreshments. However, the inspector felt there was more he could do for William, and so the very same day, after William had received his refreshments from the lodging house, the inspector insisted William accompany him to his wife's house in Ayr, nearly 14 miles, or 22.5 kilometres away, whom William had been estranged from for some time. Following the train journey to Ayr, the pair arrived at William's wife's home, and the inspector tried to convince this woman to take William back into her home. However, she was having none of it. She was not having this man back who had done nothing to maintain himself or work for quite some time. Disappointed, the inspector accompanied William back to the lodging house where he was to stay the night. However, the very next morning, it was reported that William was found expired. Okay, not so much a mystery there, I know, but what was reported next drew my attention. It was reported in the newspapers that William's body had become reduced to a mere skeleton. A skeleton overnight. So I was interested. But then the very next sentence said that a post-mortem examination had been arranged for the following week and that the results would be revealed when known. So my thinking was, can you carry out a post-mortem on a skeleton? Well, you can, but it would be called a forensic examination instead of a post-mortem. But maybe it was just called a post-mortem back then. Anyway, I was really curious what the post-mortem had said. I mean, reduced to a skeleton overnight is some feat. Well, I scoured every single inch of the 4-page Greenock Advertiser newspaper that was published for the next 3 months. Every single inch, until my eyes were smarting and I was seeing double. But there was no post-mortem results in regards to William Smith reported. It was just forgotten. There were many other post-mortem results reported, as there seemed to be quite a number of people dying suddenly at the time, but not even one sentence about William's post-mortem. So like I said, a mystery. But my conclusion is thus. William had been living rough, basically, for some time, not eating regularly and wasn't looking after himself. And so he was likely very skinny. So perhaps whoever had found William's expired body perhaps was overheard repeating that he was nothing but a skeleton, meaning he was skin and bone, not that he had literally turned into a skeleton. And whoever overheard this had perhaps spread this story as it created intrigue. And this interesting story eventually made it to the newspaper journalist and it was printed, with the journalist likely thinking, ooh, this is a right head-scratcher. A skeleton indeed. In the end, it turned out not to be a very intriguing or mysterious story after all, and maybe it was best, instead of trying to correct the story, to just forget it ever happened and never mention it again, or the post-mortem. So that's what I think. Just a game of telephone gone wrong. What do you think? Do you think the same as me, or do you think there's another explanation? That's what I'm intrigued about, what your theories are. Let me know. Okay, the last story today is about a discovery that was made in Bridgeness, which is about 19 miles or 30 kilometres west of Edinburgh, close to the banks of the Forth River. The discovery happened when the proprietor of an estate, Henry Cadell Esquire, gave permission to one of his workmen to create a garden from a piece of ground next to one of his smelting furnaces. As the workman began the task of clearing the land, he came across a large stone, the edges of which had been visible for about a year, and so he would need assistance in order to move it, as it was about 3 feet high and 9 feet wide, about 1 metre by 3 metres, although it was broken diagonally across the centre. When the stone was finally removed by the men and they turned it over, they were surprised but delighted to find that it wasn't flat on the other side, but instead it was carved on both of the broken parts, with the left side of the stone showing a Roman riding on horseback in triumph over some slain and wounded Caledonians, and on the right was a scene with an altar featuring priests and offerings of cattle. In the centre of the stone was an inscription in Latin, which was later transcribed to say, "To the Emperor Caesar Titus Aurelius Hadrianus Antonius Augustus Pius, the father of his country, the 2nd Legion Augustus, 4,000 paces of Forth and Clyde wall, they made it." It turned out this stone was a legendary tablet of the wall of Antonius Pius, and probably marked the completion of what we now know as the Antonine Wall, between the River Forth in Edinburgh and the River Clyde in Glasgow. The discovery also helped settle the debate that the Roman wall terminated on the Forth at Caradon, which is a few hundred yards or metres to the east of Bridgeness, and not, as was thought before then, terminating at Blackness, 3 miles or 4.8 kilometres further east, meaning the wall was slightly shorter than had always been assumed. The original stone tablet, which is regarded as the most detailed and best preserved tablet of its kind, can be found today in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, with a replica, which features the centre panel of the original, located near the site of the discovery. It's amazing to think that if that stone tablet had fallen the other way, carvings face up, it could have eroded away. Pretty amazing. So that's your stories this time from Scotland then, or even further back from then as it turned out. Tune in next time for even more revelations and intrigue from Scotland then. Just before I go, I have to give a shout out to everyone on Scottish Murders Instagram who was kind enough to comment on my first ever post showing my face, saying how nice it was to put a face to a voice. So thank you so much to BeatlesFan48, Picked Ink, Alicia and Sierra from Twisted and Uncorked, Misty Dawn and Alan 2, and Carol 6426. It only took me 3 years to be brave enough to put my face out there, but I'm glad I did. Also, a big thank you to everyone who supports and listens to the podcast. Just know that you're all so appreciated. So thank you. Also, a huge thank you to Jennifer MacDonald for becoming our newest Belter tier Patreon member. Jennifer, I can't thank you and all of our other Patreon members enough for kindly supporting us and allowing me to continue doing what I love. Thank you from the bottom of my heart to Misty Dawn, Julian, Lady of Innerwick Castle, Kelly, Stevie, and of course Jennifer. If you would like to become a valued Scottish Murders Patreon member, you can do so by visiting patreon.com/Scottish Murders. Thanks for listening to another episode of Scottish Murders, the twice award shortlisted fortnightly podcast that brings to light the stories of victims and their relentless pursuit for justice. If this case has captivated you, then don't forget to tell a friend to listen or check out scottishmurders.com so together we can share more Scottish murders. Until next time, I've been your host, Dawn.
Scottish Murders is a production of Courtroom.